Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's live stream reflection from this church of St Peter Mancroft in the centre of Norwich. There's a few people looking around the church this morning. Do feel free to carry on. My name's Gill Persicke, and I'm one of the lay ministers in this church. And my little talk this afternoon is going to reflect the fact that today, the 23rd of April, is of course St George's Day. Now, if I ask you to picture in your mind's eye what St George looks like, I expect many of you will come up with something pretty similar, remembered from your childhood. We see St George dressed in shining armour and mounted on a magnificent horse. But there in the corner of the picture, there's also a fair maiden, actually a damsel in distress, because she's being threatened by a dragon. But George is having none of it, and he is in the very act of running the unfortunate dragon through with his lance. It's a great picture, a great story, all very charming and medieval. But that obviously mythical dragon gives us the clue that this bears very little relation to reality. No, to fully understand St George, we need to go right back to the very earliest days of Christianity, as the new faith seeks to establish itself within the constraints of the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans themselves were actually amazingly tolerant of other religions. They put up with them, provided that those religions didn't threaten public order or Roman control. It was a very pragmatic sort of approach. So, when the early church found itself being persecuted within this empire, it was actually quite often because the local people with various kinds of pagan beliefs, those local people had actually gone to the Romans to complain about their annoying Christian neighbours, whom they might accuse of all sorts of things, of black magic or incest or cannibalism. And then the Romans felt obliged to act and carry out a bit of local repression. But a couple of centuries after Jesus' death, things changed rather. A chap called Diocletian became emperor in the year 284. And Diocletian was an authoritarian conservative. He wanted to restore the moral fibre of the empire, get back to good traditional Roman values. And so he instituted all kinds of reforms in taxation, in the law, in the Roman coinage. And he also began to centralise the policy regarding local religions. Christianity found itself very much in the firing line, and by the early 300s there are records of churches being destroyed, scriptures burned, treasures seized, all that sort of thing. Resist too strongly, and you might even find yourself being burned alive. And attention turned to the Roman army. It was decreed that all soldiers had to be prepared to make sacrifices to the Roman gods. If they didn't, initially they might just get the sack, lose their career, their army pension, their savings. But later on, the penalty for refusing to make those sacrifices was death. And George, yes, we finally got round to him, George was just one of many Christian Roman soldiers, he was an officer probably, who chose to be martyred rather than renounce their faith. George is believed to have been beheaded in a place called Lydda, which is in Palestine, in around the year 303, allegedly on the 23rd of April. And you can bet your bottom dollar that he wasn't treated with any kindness before they chopped his head off. Really ghastly. The centuries rolled on, And a few churches around Europe, including in England, found themselves dedicated to this courageous martyr, George. And in the popular imagination, he became, for very obvious reasons, a military saint, more specifically an equestrian saint, normally depicted seated on a horse. And then there came the Crusades. Now, warfare, the immense perils of warfare, have always quite naturally turned the hearts and minds of soldiers to their God. You need a great deal of divine protection if you're going to charge into battle. And the soldiers on the Crusades began to report having seen St George fighting alongside them when things got dodgy. And so, when Richard the Lionheart set off on the Third Crusade, he placed his army under the protection of St George. The king's banner showed a red cross on a white background, so bingo, that's where we get the St George's cross from. And inevitably, those few lucky soldiers who managed to limp back from the Crusades brought with them a newfound dedication to their wonderful equestrian saint. More centuries passed, and St George now wasn't forgotten, far from it. Edward III, when he founded the famous Order of the Garter in 1348, he chose George to be its patron. And from that point, St George rapidly became recognised as the patron saint of the whole of England. You can tell just how embedded this awareness was in the English consciousness from, of course, Shakespeare. When he gives Henry V his famous rallying speech before the siege of Harfleur, "Once more into the breach, dear friends," the final words Henry cries out to his troops are these: "Cry God for Harry, England, and St George." Enough to stir the heart of any red-blooded patriot. Shakespeare, by the way, is alleged both to have been born and to have died on St George's Day, the 23rd of April. Enough history. What does St George mean to us nowadays? Well, I fear his reputation has been most unfairly tarnished because he's been adopted by far-right extremists in this country. That very distinctive flag, the red cross on the white background, that flag has been tattooed onto followers of both the National Front and the English Defence League. It's been waved at hate-filled racist demonstrations over the decades. Last year's St George's Day's celebration in London turned violent when it was disrupted by men draped in the flag of St George. I hope and pray that today's celebrations will prove to be more peaceful. And what a travesty this is. St George himself is actually one of the most multinational of all saints. He was born in modern-day Turkey, spoke Greek, served in the Roman army, was killed in Palestine. And he's become the patron saint not just of England, but also of Ethiopia and Georgia and Palestine, of Beirut and Moscow, and also, incidentally, of both the Scouting movement and of people suffering from syphilis. You can't get more eclectic than that. But I can't finish without mentioning that dragon. The legend seems to date from Eastern Europe in around the 10th century, but it was such a good story that it spread fast and cemented St George as the most perfect model of bravery and chivalry. But for me, that dragon represents one thing above all others: the powers of darkness. St George engaged in a battle between darkness and light when he died for his faith. And I think it is to brave souls like him that we perhaps owe the very survival of the Christian faith in those early centuries of suppression. So we owe a great deal to St George. Let's honour him, honour his faith and his courage today. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I wish you every blessing for the rest of the day.